Preparing for your Viva. This chapter does not concern the practical, though important things, such as what clothes you should wear on the day. We get to that later on. Preparation in this context really concerns intellectual preparation. Okay, identifying your target. Let's talk briefly about what happens at the Viva. Remember, it's a live voice, so clearly there's going to be a dialogue, there's going to be a discussion, there's going to be some talking. What are we talking about? What's the dialogue on? Clearly, it's going to be on the thesis itself, the research that you have been doing these last couple of years, 3 to 5 years. Now, we would say that this usually takes place in Cambridge. Clearly, that's not going to be the case for many of you going forward in the next few months, given the global pandemic and the situation, the ongoing situation around that. So it's probably just going to happen over Skype or Zoom and so forth. But though that is different, it's not going to be in person, in the flesh, tactile. The rules, the form, pretty much the same. So who's going to be there? The same people are going to be there. You, the external examiner, the internal examiner. Now, there is a chance to have a chair who comes in and makes sure the chair comes in to make sure that the exam is being conducted in a fair way and in accordance with policy. That's usually not necessary. There are rare circumstances where that is required. So I wouldn't expect there to be a chair if I were you. If you feel there should be a chair for any reason, then your first point of call is your Director of Graduate Studies and or your administrator for postgraduate studies or postgraduate administrator. There are different titles in faculties and departments, but I'm sure you'll figure out who's right. If in extreme doubts who to contact, you can of course contact me and I will help you with that. Now, how long is a piece of string? How long is the Viva? Similar questions. The Viva takes as long as it needs to take, and there is technically not a limit. It can go on for days. I can already hear you panicking from here. I will tell you now, it's very rare for a Viva to go on for days. On average, we would expect the Viva to last about 2 hours. And that's a mean average. Okay, so it can be less than that, it can be more than that. Now, a question we're often asked is whether students need to prepare a presentation. Usually, no, but some departments, some faculties do require some of their students to open with a presentation, usually 10-20 minutes. Your supervisor should inform you if that is the case, and or the administrator for your school or faculty. If you're not sure, then ask. Always ask if you're not sure. Doesn't hurt asking, okay? So it's unlikely, but it's possible, so ask. So that's what happens at the Viva. Now, we already mentioned earlier who would be at your examination, primarily you, the internal examiner and the external examiner. And we talked a little bit about what the examiners are looking for. But I think we can afford to go into a bit more detail concerning the roles of the two examiners. What really is the difference between an internal and external examiner, apart from the obvious? And what is the obvious? Well, the obvious is that an external examiner is external to the university. Pretty straightforward. And the internal examiner is from the university, internal to the university. Now, what are their respective roles? Some universities argue that the internal and external examiner are equal. One is not the senior to the other, even if they happen to hold a more senior position. Let's say one is a professor and one is a lecturer. they argue they are equal. Their judgments are equally valid. Some argue that, okay, maybe officially that's what is the case, but actually the external examiner is the authority precisely because they're external and because they're more likely to be a senior figure. It's very hard to say what the attitude of the examiners will be because it depends on the examiners, which universities they come from, and what experiences they've had. Academics typically on these sort of procedural things tend to go along with anecdotal evidence, which is not to say it's false. A lot of this stuff is quite informal, so anecdotal evidence is important, but it's just something to bear in mind. So what's the conclusion from that? Really, that's the question of authority, who has the most authority, the internal, external examiner, is hard to answer. Most people would say the external, but there is a case to be made that they are equal to each other. I would treat them equally with respect. That should be your position. You're speaking to both of them, not just one of them. Don't take one for granted solely for the benefit of the other. That wouldn't be professional, that wouldn't be appropriate, that wouldn't be courteous, and certainly that won't help you in cultivating the sort of dialogue that you want to cultivate in the Viva. Now, with that said, let's ask ourselves what the examiners are looking for. We very much covered a lot of this in the previous video when discussing the purpose of a Viva. That is to say, they are looking for you to defend your thesis primarily. And defense doesn't mean that you're under attack, like some army stuck in a trench trying to defend yourselves from the oncoming onslaught. It actually really just means that you can provide your narrative, your story, you can join the dots, you can make it very clear what the importance, the impact, the contribution of your work is, how you arrived at that conclusion, why you arrived at that conclusion, the kind of obstacles you faced, the dead ends that you came to, the alternative paths that you had to take. You can really speak to all of those, and that gives, as I said before in the previous video, that gives the examiners a look behind the curtains, so to speak. A look behind the curtains. That's a theatrical metaphor. You know, you're seeing what's going on behind the stage, kind of seeing past the illusion, past the magic. Because there is a certain illusion in academic writing. It presents our ideas as if they were given to us in a clearly written, formatted, well thought out way, and that we had somehow embarked on our research in linear fashion. We went beginning, middle, and end. But actually, we all know that research is iterative, that we're going back and forth in this ever-expanding circle. Sometimes it goes in on itself too. It's not a straightforward process. So that's the illusion writing gives, that it is a straightforward process. Revealing what's behind the curtain is really showing to the examiners what our own wacky, chaotic process was like and how we handled it. And as I said before, that speaks to skills that go way beyond merely an academic contribution to knowledge. They involve resilience and time and project management, engaging with your literature, critical reading, organisation, quite a few things. Now, they're going to ask certain types of questions, and we're going to get onto the specific sorts of questions they ask later. But as a sort of, groundwork to that, I want to touch on this idea of zooming in and zooming out. One of the main issues with doing detailed research is that we get so lost in the detail that we often lose sight of the bigger picture, so to speak. And let's say the center of that picture, of that big picture, is the contribution to knowledge. It's the overall importance of the work. Now, of course, there's constituent components of that. There are smaller, more detailed, more nuanced bits of contribution that, taken together, accumulate to make this whole. As I said, they're constituent parts. They make this whole, this overall contribution. But we get so lost in the detail we forget what that is. So we need a kind of balancing act. We need to go between the particular and the specific and the detailed to the more general, the more abstract. Not necessarily abstract if we're dealing with concepts, yes, could be more concrete too, but nevertheless, that kind of outline. I mean abstract in that sense, sort of outline. So we could use the metaphor, in addition to the ones I just used, of zooming in and zooming out. A bit like a camera zooms in to see the finer detail and then zooms out to see the whole landscape. We're zooming in, zooming out. Now lastly, things to bring with you. Remember, we're on preparation here, so I said at the beginning of the video we'll get into the practical stuff later. What are the things you want to bring with you? Notepad and pen, probably a good idea. A copy of your thesis, definitely a good idea. A list of questions you might be asked and your planned responses. Any questions that you want to ask your examiners, and that's quite good. There might be some, don't just make up questions for the sake of it. If you have genuine questions to ask your examiners about the work, definitely ask them. Again, we're engaging in a dialogue. We're showing that we're mature, independent academics. Maybe you want to bring some additional notes which you've made during your revisions or whilst reading the thesis. I brought a copy of my thesis, an annotated copy of my thesis, and I bookmarked certain pages, things that I wanted to refer to or that I anticipated the examiners referring to, and that proved to be extremely helpful in the Viva. And perhaps maybe even a list of minor corrections that you've come across during your own revision. So again, you're anticipating the corrections they're going to make for you. I certainly did that. There was a chapter on the French philosopher Deleuze, and he has a book on the German philosopher Nietzsche. And I used some of the concepts from that book, but I didn't really go into much detail. And I only really noticed that after I submitted, and I realised how important that detail was for making my point. So I actually brought that up first in the Viva when we got to that chapter. And the external examiner was very relieved that I had. He had quite a few questions on that, but I anticipated them. So he was relieved he didn't have to ask the questions, but also quite impressed that I had got there first. He was very satisfied with that. So it's quite good to show that you've been actively thinking about this project. Again, it's about recognising limits.